Hello and welcome to a very special How I Paint Things. Now last week I did some winter themed Imperial Guard and I thought, let's carry on with a theme. It's cold, it's getting chilly, let's have a look at how you can do some US infantry for games like Bolt Action or Chain of Command in a similar sort of theme. Now this does not take a great deal of effort. A lot of this is just one coat of paint followed by a shade, so hopefully, it's nice and quick. And I think you'd be able to knock out an army looking like this with very little effort and without a whole lot of mucking around, mixing paints and what have you. So without any further mucking around, let's get a look at what we're going to need. I'll link the paints and everything in the description below. So we started by giving this guy a primer spray of Xandri Dust, which honestly you could use just about any beige here. You might even want to use brown if you want to start from a darker tone and give him sort of a darker finish overall. Army Painter's Leather Brown might be a good solution in that case, but Xandri Dust I think is going to work best for what I've got in mind. Now what I've got is a little bit of beige red, and you can see me adding just a little bit of water to the mix. And we're just going to go ahead and start with his skin. Now it might seem counterproductive, we're not painting the largest area of colour first, but because his skin is going to be quite close to some of these places, we'll actually find it easier to do this first and then avoid hitting it later on. So if I was to paint his greatcoat, let's say, and then come in and start trying to paint his face, because it's, let's say, a lower level, it's behind some of these details, we would probably find it a little difficult to actually paint it without hitting some of the stuff we'd already painted. So we work in layers. We start with our smallest and deepest layers first, and this big area of colour, his jacket, we'll do that last. Now next up we're going to paint his jacket, and there's two ways that we're going to go about this one. You can choose which you like the look of. German Camo Beige is pretty good for like a faded khaki, and that, I see a lot of people using it for the US infantry, and I think it looks really cool, but I'm going to go with Dark Sand, which is a little more yellow. They dry to a similar sort of finish. I know they don't look very similar in the bottles, but they're quite close to one another in tone. But Dark Sand is going to do us the business because I don't want these guys to look quite so faded. When we shade over the top of them too, it'll bring this down a little bit, and to my mind, I think it looks a little more grubby. Like these guys have been out in the field for a while and collected a bit of dirt. So I'm going to use Dark Sand for his Parsons jacket. If he had the thigh-length jacket, the M43, you could use instead Russian uniform or brown violet, but that's a matter of choice and what your miniature is wearing. So our skin is dry, and once again, just a little bit of water in your brush mixed into your paint will make this all the smoother to put on. Let's go ahead and apply this to his jacket. Now you'll see there are a couple of areas where I'm sort of splattering his greatcoat, and we don't care. Because we're going to paint the greatcoat another colour later. So this is what I talk about when I say, you're painting outward. Don't worry if you make any mistakes on areas that you have yet to paint. It doesn't matter. So let's get in there a little careful around his hand. And for most of this, I've got here, this is one of my army painted brushes. This is the regiment brush. So by this point, we're looking at late 1944. Most of these guys are probably going to have the green trousers. If you want to paint any of them in brown, that's fine, of course. But I'm using here just Russian uniform with, as always, a little bit of water. You'll find working from a beige will let you get away with doing most of these colors in one coat, but shh. All right, now beige brown over his rifle, and any other wooden details. So some of these guys will have their entrenching tools on them, in which case you can, a little bit of wood here. Take your time with this one because you're starting to get to some areas that you don't want to hit with any other paint. So now we've got some leather brown, and I'll give you two guesses what we're going to paint with that. Any leather details? I do like to do, weapon straps and things like that. If you've got anything like slings and the like, I tend to do those a slightly brighter brown instead and leave the leather brown for the boots, but it is a matter of preference. You may like the darker finish that it gives you. But one quick coat of this does the job. And then going back up the miniature, we're going to use Camo Olive Green and paint in his helmet. Now if there is anywhere that's going to need 2 coats, it'll probably be this one, because this is quite a dark colour. And any of the primer that shows through underneath will be quite prevalent. So take your time, and then once you've finished, if you think it needs a second shot, go ahead and give it a second coat. Now when it comes to a scarf, any kind of faded pale green will do quite well for this. So I've got here just a little green-grey. I might swap to a smaller brush to finish this off. If any of your miniatures have got mittens or something too, this is a pretty good colour for that. So I'm going to finish that off with a smaller brush off camera. And then while I have got that smaller brush out, I've got some mahogany brown, and I'm going to do the little strap on his helmet. These are quite small on the Artizan miniatures for some strange reason. It does make them a bit of a challenge. But of course, any mistakes you can just go back over with a little bit of our green later on. Now here at last we come to the fun part. Now what colour you want to paint the greatcoat is entirely up to you. A dark brown normally works pretty well, I think. I am using Flat Earth because this goes on kind of middling as far as colours go, but once we go ahead and shade it, it's going to bring that down quite a bit. Some guides will also suggest using US Field Drab, which is kind of cool, but that will look a little bit more pale in comparison. And I do want these guys to look like they've been in the field for a while. You know, they've seen a bit of action, so their jackets are a little more grubby. So I think a darker brown is going to suit us just fine. And then one final detail before we get to the good stuff is to paint in the black on his gun. Now I'm just using a straight flat black for this. I know some people like to do like shiny metal and then dull it down. Personally, I just think black looks a little more realistic. Now ordinarily from this stage, because I'm painting a metal figure, I would swap on over to the quick shade because this stuff acts as a varnish as well as a shade. And I really like the color it gives, you know, over the set of colors that I've just painted. But it does take between 24 and 48 hours to cure properly, and I like to leave it the full 48. The longer you can leave it to cure, the better a result you're going to get over the top with whatever else you happen to paint on it. Unfortunately, I don't have 48 hours to let that cure, so what we'll do instead is I'm going to use the Quick Shade, what are these? Washes. Sorry, not dip, wash. Quick Shade wash. I'm going to use Strong Tone, the same as I would from the pot, but we'll thin it out a little bit with some of the wash mixing medium, because these are quite strong, no pun intended, coming out of the bottle. So let's go ahead and 1, 2, 3, let's go 4. And then with our mixing medium, we'll go 1, 2, 3. Doesn't need to be a straight 1-to-1 mix. I find just a little bit stronger on the wash does tend to help. Now this, interestingly enough, goes a little bit cloudy when you're mixing it in, so it can be a little unsettling the first time you use it. But once I've got that all mixed in the way I like, I've got the large dry brush here because I like the wedge tip. And then we're just going to go ahead and bathe the model in this. You don't want it to collect quite like that on his face. Just smush it on, make sure it's in all of the recesses, and then move it away from any areas where you think it's going to collect just a little too much. But make sure you are covering the whole miniature. You want to work fairly quickly, but make sure that all of it is bathed in this gunk, and then we'll give it about half an hour to dry. Now he's had about half an hour to dry, and doesn't that just make a world of difference? I really like the shading that the Quick Shade stuff gives, and I think, like I said, in this case I would probably have preferred to use the dip, but that is not a bad turnout at all. I think we tend to put a little too much thought sometimes into painting these guys for the table. What I am going to do now, though, is because there is no varnish on him and he is metal, I do want to quickly spray varnish him. So I'm going to use the anti-shine varnish from Army Painter, stick to that range for a moment. And then with that done, what I'm going to do is go ahead and base him straight away. There are a couple of steps extra that we will do, but I just want to show you what it would look like to go ahead and finish this guy off so that he's ready for the table. If you were speed painting Army, this is where I would stop and then do the base, put him on the table. So let's get a look at that. Now with his base finished, our soldier is complete. And to be perfectly honest, as I've mentioned a couple of times, I would quite happily put that on the table and get playing with it. If your army looks like this, get in touch, we'll play some games, But there are a couple of things that we can do just to knock it out a little bit. Say you've got some officers or something that you want to spend a little bit more time on, or you just happen to have the hobby time. What I would suggest, there are 3 areas to really sort of improve on. And I'm just going to bring the light in a little more here. Now, what we'll do, first of all, is add a little bit more to the skin. Because I like, beige red, but it can be a little bit flat. So I've got here, this is some Flesh Wash from Army Painter still. And what we're going to do is just add this over the top of the skin, being careful not to get too generous with it when we come near, clothing or weaponry or what have you. But just a thin coat of this, and then let that dry. Now because we have put 2 shades over that beige red, if you wanted to highlight with it, you could go back to your base coat. I'm going to use Barbarian Flesh from Army Painter though, because it's got a little bit more kind of peachiness to it, and I think that's going to work a little better overall. So I'm going down to my character brush, and I'm just going to put a few little dots for knuckles. This of course is easier when you haven't got the camera, as I'm fond of saying. But on his face, if you go for his nose, chin, just a little across the cheekbones, that's enough to add quite a bit of depth to that model. And as you see, it makes his skin look just that little bit more natural. So that's quite cool. Then we'll use just a tiny bit of Vallejo gunmetal just to pick out a couple of tiny wee bits along the tops of the barrel, any sights. You don't want to go crazy with this, but it will add a bit, especially from a distance. And then finally, the last highlight that I would apply on these guys is going to be some tan earth. Remember that we used flat earth for the jacket. I'm now going to use tan earth just to do a few little edge highlights, just in places where I want to bring out some of the details. So up on his collar, you don't have to go crazy with this. I would suggest you probably don't want to go full on edge highlight everything, but just a few areas where you want to call attention to the edge of details. That'll do the job quite nicely. So there we have it with just a couple of lines of tan earth. He is ready to rock and roll. It wouldn't take a great deal to do this to your whole army, I think, and it does add a little bit more. So like I said, maybe stick to your NCOs and officers if you want to save some time, but I think as far as, battle ready goes, our dude is ready for the table. So hopefully there, guys, something was interesting to you. Remember, the tutorial I just did on painting Valhallans would also work perfectly well if you were doing, for example, Germans or something, if you wanted to face off against these guys in the winter. Or this might just work well if you want to do some Imperial Guard in a similar sort of colour scheme. As always, my Twitter and Facebook are both linked down there too. So thank you very much for your time, and you guys enjoy the rest of your day.